The streets were alive with the usual hustle and bustle, but amidst the noise and movement, one moment stopped Big Shaq in his tracks. The man known for his humor, his energy, and his larger-than-life personality was suddenly frozen, his eyes locked onto a sight that hit him deeper than words could ever express. An elderly man, frail and bent with age, was pushing a cart loaded with what looked like everything he owned. His steps were slow, heavy, and full of struggle. Every few inches he paused, wiped his brow, and pushed forward again. The weight of his burden, both the physical and the unseen, was written all over his face. People walked past, some glancing his way, but most carried on with their lives, unaware or uninterested. But not Shaq. Big Shaq had seen a lot in his life. From the highs of fame to the struggles behind closed doors, he knew what it meant to fight through hard times. But this was different. His chest tightened as he watched the old man continue, each step more heartbreaking than the last. There was something in the man's eyes, a mix of exhaustion, pain, and silent endurance, that broke Shaq's heart on the spot. He felt his throat tighten, his vision blur. And before he knew it, tears were streaming down his face. Shaq wasn't one to cry easily. He had built his brand on laughter, on jokes that made the world feel a little lighter. But at this moment, nothing felt funny. This wasn't just an old man struggling. This was a symbol of something bigger. A reminder of how tough life could be, how easy it was for people to be forgotten, and how kindness was needed now more than ever. Without thinking twice, Shaq stepped forward. His mind raced. What could he do? How could he help? He had money, sure, but was that enough? This wasn't just about handing over cash. It was about something deeper, something more human. What happened next left everyone around him speechless. No one expected it. Not the people watching, not even Shaq himself. But in that moment he knew this was bigger than just one act of kindness. This was about making a real difference. And what he did next, you won't believe it. Stay tuned. Shaq took a deep breath and wiped his face, but the tears kept coming. He had no shame in showing emotion, not now. This wasn't about him. This was about the man in front of him, the old man who carried more than just the weight of that cart. He carried a lifetime of struggle, of hardships most people couldn't even imagine. Shaq watched as the man stopped again, leaning on the cart for support. His hands trembled from exhaustion, his thin frame barely holding up. Shaq stepped closer, his heart pounding. He didn't want to just walk up and make the man feel uncomfortable. He needed to understand who was he. How did he end up here? And why was no one stopping to help? As Shaq stood there, a few people around him started to take notice. Some whispered, some pulled out their phones, but no one else moved. It was almost as if they were waiting to see what Shaq would do. He wasn't just any guy on the street. People recognized him, and that meant whatever he did next would be seen by many. He took another step forward and gently called out, "Sir, you need help." The old man barely looked up. His eyes were tired, sunken. For a moment he hesitated, as if unsure whether to respond. Then, in a voice so weak that Shaq had to lean in to hear, he whispered, I gotta keep going." That answer hit Shaq harder than he expected. This wasn't just a moment of struggle, this was survival. The old man wasn't pushing that cart for no reason. He was on a mission, but for what? Was he homeless? Was he searching for someone? So many questions flooded Shaq's mind, but before he could ask, the man gripped the cart tighter and tried to push forward again. Shaq couldn't just stand there anymore. He reached out, gently touching the man's shoulder. "Wait, just tell me where you're going. Maybe I can help." The man looked up then, really looked at Shaq for the first time. His eyes were filled with something even deeper than exhaustion, something that made Shaq's stomach twist. Pain, but not just physical pain. This was something else, something that had been sitting inside this man for years, maybe even decades. For a second, the man opened his mouth like he was going to say something. But then he stopped. His lips pressed together, and he shook his head, almost as if he didn't believe anyone could truly help him. Shaq wasn't about to give up that easily, not even close. The younger man's voice was cold, distant. "You shouldn't have come here." The old man flinched, like the words had struck him harder than any physical blow. His fingers curled tighter around the cart, his lips trembling as he tried to find the right thing to say. But before he could, his son took another step back, shaking his head. Shaq felt his chest tighten. He had been expecting a lot of things: shock, maybe even anger. But not this. Not rejection, not the look in the son's eyes, filled with something deeper than just disappointment. It was almost like fear. The old man's voice cracked as he spoke. I wanted to see you. I had to find you." The younger man glanced around, his body tense. "You don't get it," he muttered. "You being here, it's not safe." Shaq frowned. Something wasn't right. The way the son kept looking over his shoulder, the way his hands were still stuffed deep into his pockets. It was like he was afraid of being seen. But by who? The old man took a shaky step forward, his frail body barely holding itself up. "Please, just talk to me." His voice was desperate now, filled with years of regret, years of silence that he was trying to break. For a moment, the son hesitated, his jaw tightened, and something flickered across his face, something like pain. But just as quickly, he turned his head away. "You don't understand," he whispered. Shaq could feel a tension thick in the air. This wasn't just a strained father-son relationship. There was something more at play here, something neither of them was saying. And then, before anyone could react, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the alley behind them. Shaq turned just in time to see two men stepping out of the shadows. They were rough-looking, their eyes sharp and unreadable. One of them muttered something under his breath, and the son immediately stiffened. "Who are they?" Shaq asked, his voice low. The younger man swallowed hard. "You need to go," he said quickly, his voice urgent now. "Both of you." The old man shook his head, confused. "But I came all this way for you." The son's face twisted with something close to panic. He glanced at the two men, who were now walking toward them with purpose. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something that made Shaq's blood run cold. "You don't understand. They're here for me." Shaq's pulse quickened. The son's words hung heavy in the air. "They're here for me." The two men were closing in fast, their expressions unreadable. Shaq wasn't sure if they were just here to intimidate or if things were about to take a turn for the worse. Either way, he knew one thing: the old man wasn't going anywhere. He had fought too hard to get here. The son turned back to his father, desperation in his eyes. "Please," he whispered, "just go. I can handle this." But the old man didn't move. His frail hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "Not without you." The tension was suffocating now. The two men finally stopped a few feet away, their eyes flicking between Shaq and the old man before settling on the son. One of them, a tall guy with a scar on his cheek, crossed his arms. "Thought you weren't gonna run," he muttered. Shaq could feel the son's whole body go rigid. His hands finally left his pockets, clenching into fists at his sides. "I didn't," he said quietly. "I was just saying goodbye." The scarred man let out a low chuckle. "That's so." He turned his gaze toward the old man, sizing him up. "Didn't know you had family." The younger man swallowed hard. "He's got nothing to do with this." But the old man stepped forward, standing as tall as his frail frame would allow. "He's my son," he said firmly. "And if you're here for him, you'll have to go through me." Shaq felt his heart squeeze. This man, this exhausted, broken man, had been fighting his whole life. And now, even at his weakest, he was willing to stand between his son and whatever danger was coming. The scarred man narrowed his eyes. For a moment, no one moved. Then, to everyone's surprise, he sighed and shook his head. "Ain't worth it," he muttered to his partner. "Not with all these people watching." Shaq realized then there were eyes on them. People had stopped on the sidewalk, phones were out, recording. The moment had turned into something bigger than just them. The other man, shorter, stockier, grunted in frustration. "This isn't over," he warned the son. Then, without another word, they turned and walked back into the alley, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Shaq exhaled, only now realizing he had been holding his breath. He turned to the son, who was still frozen in place, his face pale. "You good?" Shaq asked. What he did next would change everything. Shaq felt something in his chest tighten. This wasn't just an old man struggling to get somewhere. This was someone carrying a weight far heavier than that cart. The way he hesitated, the way his eyes flickered with something unspoken, it was like he had been alone for so long that he no longer expected help from anyone. But Shaq wasn't just anyone. Still, he didn't want to push too hard. He could tell the man was guarded, holding something back. So instead of forcing the conversation, he did the one thing he knew might make a difference. He stepped beside him, placed his hands on the cart, and started pushing. The old man's head snapped up in surprise. His thin fingers loosened their grip for just a second as he watched Shaq effortlessly take on the weight of the cart. For the first time, Shaq caught a glimpse of something else in his expression. Not relief, not gratitude, just pure shock. Like he couldn't believe someone would actually step in. "Where we headed?" Shaq asked, keeping his voice light, casual. He didn't want to make the man feel like a charity case. He just wanted to help. The old man hesitated again, then let out a sigh, as if carrying a secret too heavy to bear. "Couple more blocks," he mumbled. Shaq nodded, saying nothing more. He just kept pushing. As they moved down the street, people started noticing. Some stopped to take pictures, others whispered among themselves. A few even reached out, offering food, water, or cash. It was as if Shaq's presence had suddenly made this man visible, like people only paid attention once someone famous stepped in. And that thought made Shaq's stomach turn. How many times had this man walked these streets, pushing this cart, struggling, without a single person stopping to ask if he was okay? How many others were out here, fighting their own battles, invisible to the world? But there was something else bothering Shaq. The more he walked beside the man, the more he noticed the way he glanced around, almost nervously. Like he wasn't just struggling, he was searching. For what? For someone, for something. Shaq wanted to ask, but before he could, the old man suddenly stopped. His body tensed, his eyes locked onto something up ahead. And in that moment, Shaq knew, whatever this man had been holding onto, whatever had kept him moving all this time, it was right in front of them. But what they found when they got there, that changed everything. Shaq felt his heartbeat pick up as he followed the old man's gaze. Something had changed in the air around them. The man, who had been moving so slowly just moments ago, suddenly seemed tense, his grip tightening on the cart again. His eyes were locked on something or someone ahead. Shaq turned to see what had caught his attention. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just a stretch of sidewalk, a few people walking by, and a small alleyway tucked between two buildings. But then Shaq noticed it. A figure stood near the alley, partially hidden in the shadows. It was hard to tell at first, but as they moved closer, Shaq saw that it was a younger man, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, dressed in worn-out clothes, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. His eyes were darting around, nervous, as if he wasn't sure whether to run or stay put. The old man inhaled sharply, his body going stiff. Shaq noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the cart. "Is that someone you know?" Shaq asked quietly. The old man didn't answer right away. His breathing had changed, short, uneven, like he was bracing for something. Finally, in barely more than a whisper, he said, "That's my son." Shaq felt a wave of shock hit him. This man, who had looked so lost, so alone, had been pushing this heavy cart all this way for a reason, and that reason was standing just a few feet away. But there was something wrong. The way the son was standing, the way he kept shifting on his feet, it wasn't the reaction Shaq had expected. There was no rush forward, no tears, no embrace, just hesitation. Shaq glanced at the old man, whose eyes were now glistening with something between hope and fear. He had come all this way. He had carried everything he owned, step by painful step, just to find his son. But now that he was here, would his son even take him back? Before Shaq could say anything, the younger man took a step forward. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, something raw. And then finally he spoke. But the words that came out of his mouth made Shaq's stomach drop. Because in that moment, Shaq realized this wasn't the reunion the old man had been hoping for. The younger man hesitated, then finally looked at his father. And for the first time, Shaq saw something shift in his expression. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something deeper, something like regret. "I messed up," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got caught up in the wrong things. I thought I had no one." He swallowed hard. "But you came for me." The old man's eyes filled with tears, but he smiled, a small, tired smile. "Always." Shaq felt his own throat tighten. He had stepped in just wanting to help. But what he had witnessed was something bigger than himself. A father's love, stronger than fear. A second chance, given when it was least expected. And as the son reached out, hesitant, uncertain, his father took his hand without hesitation. A bond, broken by time and mistakes, slowly mending right before Shaq's eyes. It wasn't a perfect ending, but sometimes just having someone show up, that was enough. For a moment, everything was still. The weight of what had just happened lingered in the air, heavy but not unbearable. The old man's hand was wrapped around his son's, thin fingers gripping tightly as if afraid to let go again. And the son, who had looked so distant just moments ago, held on just as tightly. Shaq watched in silence, feeling something deep in his chest. He had stepped in without knowing the full story, without realizing the pain and history these two carried. But now, standing here, he understood. It wasn't just about struggle. It was about love, redemption, and the simple power of showing up when it mattered most. The old man wiped at his eyes and let out a shaky laugh. "Guess I still got some fight left in me," he said, his voice softer now. The son shook his head, a mix of guilt and relief in his expression. "I should have come looking for you," he admitted. "I thought I was too far gone." The old man smiled. "You were never too far." Shaq felt a lump in his throat. He had spent years making people laugh, bringing energy and joy wherever he went. But this moment, this was different. This wasn't about entertainment. This was real life, messy, painful, and beautiful all at once. A few people nearby had stopped recording, realizing this wasn't just some viral moment. It was something deeper. Some nodded at Shaq in respect. Others just stood quietly, moved by what they had witnessed. The old man looked up at Shaq then, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. "For stopping, for helping." Shaq shook his head. "Nah, man. You're the real one here." The son exhaled, like he was letting go of something heavy. "I need to fix some things," he admitted, "but I don't want to do it alone." The old man squeezed his hand. "You won't have to." And just like that, the weight between them seemed to lift. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely was. But it was a new beginning. A chance to move forward. Shaq watched them walk away together, the old man's steps still slow, but now they weren't alone. And as he stood there, taking it all in, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the smallest moments, the quietest acts of kindness, could change everything.